Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing Benefit by Jethro Tull.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
Oh, Jethro Tull, you know them all, I don't need to introduce them to you. This is their third studio album, and with it we are completing, basically getting to know Jethro Tull all the way up until their masterpiece, Aqualung, and I'm so happy for it. So to start off this video, here are some of my favorite bits from this album.
Just 1 week for the feeling to go, and with you there to help me, then it probably will.
Hung from the trapeze, whose fall will satisfy.
So I have some unfortunate news, especially for the people who watch this series regularly as it is coming out. This is unfortunately the last time we will encounter Jethro Tull this year. Yes, I know, we're still even a bit more than 100 episodes to completion, yet we've already visited each and every Jethro Tull album on the list. And these guys, they've gotten 5 whopping times of actual episodes made about them. Most bands, I don't think any band has reached 4 times yet Jethro Tull is already at 5, and that's amazing. So with that being said, as unfortunate as it is, I'm so happy that I got to know this band so well this year. So we started off getting to know Jethro Tull in episode 31 when we reviewed Stormwatch, which also happened to be a pretty successful episode all in all. And then we went on a big hiatus until only in episode 166 were we presented with the debut album of the band called This Was. This one was shortly followed up by episode 189 in which we reviewed their second album called Stand Up, and then we went into this slight hiatus once more up until quite recently with episode 249 when we reviewed the later Heavy Horses, and now in just a short break we are coming back for the last time to review the third studio album, the one that completes the entire saga of the great old days of Jethro Tull, and that's of course the 1970 release called Benefit. Now this album came in a monumental moment for Jethro Tull's career. Their last album, Stand Up, was a big success. People really liked it and it showed a lot of promise in the direction they were going with, so knowing that they had to up their production level and do something bigger than life with this one in order to actually succeed. And well, this really shows on this album. The overall production and compositions on here do sound more cohesive and much more refined in a way that I personally really happen to like. So aside from having the usual lineup that we've grown to know with Jethro Tull by this point, of course them being Ian Anderson, Clive Bunker, Martin Barr, and Glenn Cornick, we also have another interesting member on here being John Evan, which technically isn't a full-time member of the band by this point, but he serves a great purpose on here, taking most of the keyboard parts and the piano parts from Ian Anderson to himself, letting Ian basically focus more on the guitar, the flute, and of course on his beautiful vocals. And that is of course not to minimize the effect of Evan and his own. Of course he plays the piano on here mainly, and by god does it sound so good, and his sound is what makes this album and the ones that come after it so entirely unique. And personally, while I loved Stand Up a bunch, I do believe that the overall production and compositions on here are most focused, and that's a really good thing, especially Especially I would like to point out Martin Barr with his guitars. He excels on playing the acoustic guitar in the folky moments, but also going very heavy at times with the electric guitar, a thing that would prove faithful in the creation of Aqualung. Glenn Cornick of course provides his killer bass lines also on here, and while I don't believe that there's a single track that he shines on with the bass, I do pretty much love his contributions with the Hammond organ on the last track called Society, You're a Woman. Of course we also have Dee Palmer as a contributor on this album, and of course she does the orchestral arrangements as well on here, although I would say that they are more subtle than they would be found on Stand Up, but still they add a lot of personality, which would later shine of course in Aqualung, Thick as a Brick, and what would come afterwards. I would say that Clive Bunker probably is the weakest player on here, but weak isn't really the word I like using, because the fact is, while he doesn't really excel and go overboard, he always plays the right part. You know, a la Nick Mason with Pink Floyd, he just plays the right part for each and every song, and I guess that I just have to appreciate him for it. And of course, lastly but not least, it's Ian Anderson, which I believe he has gotten into the right mindset. He isn't wandering around just meandering in the dark trying to find the direction for Jethro Tull. In this album it seems to me like the direction is found, and now it just has to be refined in order to create something that is entirely great. As I said many times throughout this video, of course that being Aqualung. I love the fact that Ian was able with his compositions on here to find the right balance between rock music, folk music, and just the heaviness and the rawness of the Jethro Tull sound. If there's something that I really enjoyed about listening to the first 3 albums by Jethro Tull, was to see how a blues band that was playing blues back in 1968 suddenly changed their sound so much, but so gradually as well, to actually form 1971's Aqualung. You know, there are certain bands which have an awful debut, but then they just kind of pick themselves out of nowhere and create an awesome album afterwards, yet with Jethro Tull the case is different. We can definitely see how Mick Abrams influenced the creation of the first album, basically trying to lean the band in a very bluesy and non-progressive direction, but after he left the band you can clearly see how Anderson basically takes the handles and leads this band into absolute greatness, always doing this slight shift from one album to the other, always making sense of how things would go on to be. And yes, what can I say, if before listening to this album I couldn't quite realize how Stand Up happened to become Aqualung, I suddenly realized that Benefit is the missing link that explains everything. Now getting a bit more into details, personally I think that all of the tracks on this entire album are definitely great, and while there is some downgoings in this album, I do believe that it's really good. But if I had to point out 2 tracks in particular, I would say that the first 2 tracks on this album are absolute 10s out of 10s for me. So with you there to help me and nothing to say are just marvelous tracks that were easily or could have easily been plucked out of Aqualung and I wouldn't have noticed. They sound exactly like an Aqualung composition. They are so good. Everything from the echoing flute to the vocals to the instrumentation of the entire band playing together as equals, it's just so fun to listen to, and honestly it was really hard for me to pick a favorite out of the 2, but I think I'm gonna go with the first track. I will admit that if I had to point out any sort of flaw in this album, the one that I would go after is the shorter tracks in particular. Now, a lot of this album is comprised of these shorter tracks, and I do believe that the band excels when it comes to the longer compositions, and you can definitely see it even the amount of plays of these songs in Spotify itself. And well, I think that the shorter compositions are fine as they are, but they don't really get the time to mature and develop, and that's something that they later built upon and actually excelled when doing Aqualung. But if there's one track on here that kind of really caught me by surprise, and not in a good way, it had to be the third to last track called Inside. This one doesn't belong on here. I don't know why it is such an anomaly. It doesn't sound good, the production doesn't sound good, it doesn't feel like it's supposed to be here, the composition is entirely off, and I honestly don't get what it's doing on this album. It seems like they just had a bit more time that they needed to fill up, so they took a demo out of like an old drawer, put it in there, thought that no one would notice, and unfortunately I noticed a hell of a lot. Honestly, I don't like this song that much, and I couldn't for the life of me explain the anomalous characteristics of this one. But for the rest of the compositions, as I said, they are great and they give you the slightest peek around the corner to see what's to come next. And with Jethro Tull back in the day, I do believe that a lot of people probably thought that this was a great album, yet not knowing what was about to hit them only a year after. So to sum things up, I do believe that the right space of mind and headspace in order to create Aqualung was found on here, and I'm not talking about Thick as a Brick. I have no idea how Jethro Tull came up with that. It's such an anomaly in the world of music, and of course with the band itself, but it is so good. But we're not talking about that. I think that the band finally found the right direction with this one, and the keyword here is of course prog. Up until this point, these guys couldn't have been directly identified as progressive rock, but now after this album, it is clear as day, these guys have implemented the prog element into their music and thus cemented themselves as one of the best prog bands ever. So when come to compare this album to Stand Up, I do believe that Benefit is only a slightly better than Stand Up in overall quality, although I would rate the two the same. And if you're an avid viewer of this channel, you might already know what this rating will be, because I've of course openly said my rating of Stand Up back in episode 189, but if you don't know, you might want to stick around for just a moment, because I'm firstly gonna talk about this album's cover. So if there's one thing that you can definitely say about the covers of Jethro Tull, is that other than having the one consistent, which is featuring Ian Anderson on them, they can honestly look whatever at every single turn. Like, even look at the band since their start. So the first cover of theirs of course features the band, but features them in a photo with very costumish outfits, and then we have the second cover for Stand Up, which features caricatures of the band drawn in a hand drawing and line art. And now suddenly we reach this cover, of course featuring the band, but now they are paper cutouts on a paper cutout stage. Now this cover, it's an odd one. It's also good, but it's also very much odd. I don't think that it's a bad cover, but it's trying to actually put the band in the middle, making them the focus of things, but honestly it doesn't entirely work for me. And something about the pale and very much dead colors on here doesn't let this one shine and actually be vibrant and noticeable. So while I do believe that this is a cover done right, it kind of gets everything wrong in a sense, and it's not as memorable as the others, and that might also indicate why this album kind of falls between the chairs when looking back at it in hindsight. So as I said, this one is slightly better than Stand Up, but they both get the same rating, and of course that's a rating of 8 out of 10. But that's about it guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to 801 Live by 801. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wanham, Ristav Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.